Hello, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, and joining me, the head of betting innovations, Ben Brown at Pro Football Focus. New title since the last time we talked, Ben?
Yeah, it's a little bit. Obviously, some changes happened in the PFF, headquarters and world. Yeah, all things considering, but yeah, there is still a focus on betting, and thankfully, I'm more positioned, I would say, to at least steer some of that direction. So it's been interesting, but it's definitely good. Excited for the off season, though. I'll say that much. So.
Well, the biggest betting event in the universe coming up in the Super Bowl, but I have some bigger picture bets for you. I wrote down 8 bets, and I want to ask you if you would make them. And they're not like, hey, Miles Sanders over 14 and a half receiving yards or something. I got bigger picture bets, but have you started your process of figuring out which bets you're going to make for the Super Bowl? Because I do feel like the prop world is probably the only place where people can get any sort of actual edge, but I'm not even sure that's really true for the Super Bowl because there's so many eyeballs on it.
Yeah, I mean, it is obviously interesting, and the dynamics change a little bit. Like if you're trying to take this as a job sort of thing, obviously you want to be betting early and often, but there is obviously a lot of other considerations going into it because like the majority of money coming in for the Super Bowl is very much what people would consider this public side or very public betting because so many more people are betting, right? And those sorts of people kind of tend to push the direction of numbers towards the over. So if you are, more of a systematic bettor that's trying to make money or something, in some ways, playing the opposite side of that towards the end as we get closer to kickoff and maybe betting some unders at that point, can be a worthwhile approach. And it's sort of how I've, gone over it previously. But, kind of what you said, like there's so many markets and so many offerings that we only see for the Super Bowl that there are a lot of opportunities for people to kind of not necessarily price out correctly all of the events that are going to happen. So that's where I'm kind of trying to come in and fill in the gaps and maybe provide, some resistance in those other markets, I would say right now.
So what is the stupidest, smartest bet that someone can make around the Super Bowl? Is it the anthem? Because that's always a thing. And now, isn't it true that the anthem has gone over like a bunch of times or gone under? Is there's some sort of streak involving the anthem?
Yeah, it's gone over a number of times. I also think that we very much that's a market that moves on information very quickly. So I think like 2 years ago there was like a release time recorded from when the person was practicing or whatever. Then like the market swung like 25 cents or something. So you very rarely see markets swing so much like you can some of these like information based ones. But I do think that is one in particular we very much usually get information on. I know that's a spot where I very much, I think people are just guessing on, but being able to identify the two, I do think definitely creates some opportunities for people if, they're doing the research and really digging in and trying to kind of read between the lines, I would say.
How about the kickoff? Can you do whether it goes out of the back of the end zone or whatever? Like there's something for almost every play.
Right. It is very interesting. And like kind of one of my jobs the past couple seasons has been trying to, I would say, like price out a lot of these events that we don't normally have. So that was very much one of them. And kind of like understanding like how much of there is like a league wide trend as far as like kickoffs going into the end zone or going in as touchbacks do you use, and how much of it is, player specific for each team and those sorts of things. And it is a balancing act. And I think with the books, kind of only doing it, once every year, it's very much more of an ad hoc process from their end. And I think when that happens, like it does create some weird outcomes in those sorts of things. But from like PFF's perspective, and one thing that I've worked on last season, we've tried to build up this what's more called like a play-by-play simulation, and that would give us a lot of the opportunities to price out a lot of these other markets. So that's kind of where I would say digging into this week is not only seeing what we price out, but like kind of comparing that to the betting market, maybe seeing if we have some blind spots in our own modeling and those sorts of things.
See, I was going to make fun of you about the, betting innovations thing, but then you come back with that. So let me get to my 8 bets that I wrote down, and I want you to tell me, would you make them? And then we can have discussions. So 4 are kind of around the league, and then 4 regard the Vikings. I want to start out with this. Patrick Mahomes for the rest of his career, would you bet that he wins over 1.5 more Super Bowls?
I'm gonna say after this year, I would bet the over. I in some ways I'm including this year as kind of that calculation, but the way in which he kind of, I would say, arrived at the big stage once again, losing Tyreek Hill, kind of being banged up, like not having the receiving unit that very much, a lot of other quarterbacks would need in football. Like, I think it speaks to almost, and I don't think longevity is the right word, but a way in which that he can continue to kind of perform and bring the team to be like the best team in football and not necessarily have a lot of auxiliary pieces around him. So I think you definitely have to be, I would say, more bullish on his long-term outlook, given kind of how he was arrived at it throughout the playoffs. And I very much think that, for that reason, like the bullish case, I would say, is, quite high still for Patrick Mahomes, and something that, very much could see him winning, 2 or 3 or even 4 more Super Bowls here before he really, caters off onto the less prime time of his career, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, think about like just when he got in the league in 2018, they had one of the worst defenses in the entire NFL, and they were a play or two away from beating Tom Brady, and maybe a bad call or two away. So for the NFL is rigged people, they were rigging it against him back then. And then now apparently they're rigging it for him. But I mean, he was that close with a horrendous defense. So they improved their defense. They win the Super Bowl. Then he gets this close with a horrendous offensive line, kind of overcomes that, gets to the Super Bowl. They improve that. Now he's back. I mean, it's really remarkable how he cannot be like pushed off of being in championship weekend, almost no matter what else happens. Because if you took even the 10th best quarterback in the NFL and took away Tyreek Hill from them, they're probably like a 10-win team or a 9-win team, and they're not playing in championship weekend because there just wouldn't be enough weapons for them. And yet, I don't know what the word is actually is like. There's probably a word for it, but just this immovable object, like he's going to be there one way or the other. So it's almost crazy to bet any player to win more than one, even when they're in the Super Bowl. I mean, almost anyone like that made a Super Bowl, you would say like, oh, they'll probably never get back because that's just the odds. And yet for him, he's so much different than anybody else that you'd ever be betting on.
Yeah, and it is 100% true. And it is like this idea of like he's kind of always found a way to be there at the end. Maybe he hasn't gotten, all the breaks, but when he hasn't gotten all the breaks, they've still very much had the opportunities. And I would say, going back to last week's game, like they were clearly the better team, but Cincinnati did kind of have, did have the ball with under 2 minutes to go, with tie game with Joe Burrow, really only needing a field goal to probably win that matchup. They did convert a 3rd and 16 and still couldn't probably get into field goal range. And I just think when you are a quarterback that could continuously at least have your team in those sort of situations, like you're going to end up ahead, even if, a few of the breaks and a few of the games and a few of the years don't even go your way. So, I also think like there is, specifically with Patrick Mahomes compared to where everyone else is right now, like we've already seen them kind of navigate where he's at on, the veteran contract, and he's very much locked in long-term, and they can kind of, maybe try some different things from a team building perspective to build around him and see what's going to provide him to be the most successful. But they're the one team I think that can kind of have that experimentation now with the understanding that he is going to be an elite quarterback. Whereas, the Joe Burrows, of the world and everything else, and even the Philadelphia Eagles, like they're still figuring out how good these guys are going to potentially be on a veteran contract, and when they don't have all these pieces in place around them, right? So I think that that's probably the main reason why I would be, so bullish on his long-term outlook, even though, like you said, like, even with him playing in the Super Bowl, there very much is probably a number of reasons why you shouldn't take the over 1.5 in that scenario.
I'm sure you're excited to hear if he loses, as someone who's from Minnesota, that he can't win the big game. Guaranteed to be the narrative if he doesn't win this one. Okay, I like that one too. And I think that it just sort of speaks to like him as this complete outlier that maybe is different from almost anyone in history except for like literally Tom Brady, in the way that you view him. That how many teams that did Brady play on that had completely different rosters that turned over everyone around him, and yet it was still him. Of course, he did let a little air out of the ball, so that probably was the only reason that he was able to do that. But I mean, it's amazing how like there's only a couple of these players really through history that have this type of effect, and he's one of them. The next one I had for you is would you bet that anyone except for Brock Purdy or Trey Lance is playing quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers next year?
I mean, before this morning when I woke up and found out that Tom Brady was retired, I would have like at least considered him to be a potential option there. I know, a lot of people listening are going to be Vikings, backers and supporters. And I do think there's, a reasonably good case for me being excited if they somehow got Kirk Cousins involved in the 49ers, quarterback search. But I would be very surprised if like anybody else kind of, they still have, I would say, a ton of remaining questions about Trey Lance to the point where they're going to want to keep him on the roster for another season and not necessarily sell low on his potential, especially given what they gave up. So I think he's there next year. Obviously Brock Purdy should very much be there. I know his the surplus value on his contract already is more than paid for it, even what he provided through 8 or 9 games for them this season. But I think he's going to be in the fold. The more interesting question is given the injury considerations and everything else, like who's actually starting for them at the end of the season. But I would be, I would say shocked to say that I would be very surprised if like Trey Lance didn't have at least some opportunities to start football games in the regular season next year. So my bet would be on the no. I do think it's probably going to be just Brock Purdy and Trey Lance and trying to figure out how good Kyle Shanahan could be with either one of those guys.
Yeah, I mean, because Trey Lance will be at full health by that point, and you can plan on him being your quarterback. And then whenever Brock Purdy is ready, if you need to turn to Brock Purdy, you can. And what we've seen from that team is even if Trey Lance was not good, they would probably still win half their games anyway,
right?
Assuming that they don't have any catastrophic things happen to them before the beginning of next season. Like that roster is mostly going to stay together. And this is an injury that Brock Purdy has that other quarterbacks have had. It's not exactly like a baseball player having it, but even when baseball players have Tommy John, they just come back and they're really good pitchers again. So I assume that if they do think that Brock Purdy can really be their guy, that he'll be ready to go by some point next season and be able to step back in. But there's always that in the back of my mind, like teams get anxious when they get close and then they do stuff. And with Cousins, I can't make it work in my head though, because the Vikings would have to trade him there. And if you're the Vikings, are you in a position to be like, oh yeah, fellow NFC team who I think they're going to play next year, here's a good quarterback that you were able to be as good as you were with Brock Purdy. Why don't you have an even better quarterback? Like, why would you do that? Plus the salary cap considerations, the 49ers are going to have their cap and a lot of players that have been good for them get expensive next year. I just can't like make that happen. But that love affair between Shanahan and Cousins just always kind of rests over everything.
Right. It very much just lingers as like, I don't know if it's a pipe dream for some or a nightmare for others, but it very much always seems to have, some sort of connection. And we see that across the league, but kind of going back to it, I know you mentioned an interesting point about like Trey Lance specifically and how he wouldn't even really need to be all that great for them to arrive at even, an above 500, record with him kind of starting. But I do think there is like an interesting floor that Trey Lance can provide, especially with his legs and that offense where he probably, if he was asked to make a lot of the same throws that Brock Purdy was asked to make down the stretch and then also provided, a little bit in the rushing attack. And he was kind of opening up things in a way that we've seen, more dynamic, other dynamic quarterbacks kind of open up things for their running back like Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson. Like that kind of, adds an interesting wrinkle to that offense as well. And I think one of the main reasons why they went up and actually made the move for him when he did. So I still think there's even, if he doesn't end up being a top 5 or top 10 passing quarterback, there is still a number of ways or levers that I think Kyle Shanahan could still have a really successful offense with him kind of running the show. So I do think it's bullish. And I know like the Cousins thing it's unfortunate, and his contract and everything else just doesn't make a ton of sense. But it's definitely a spot where I agree with you. Like the Vikings seem like even though maybe they shouldn't, they very much are probably setting up to kind of run back where they were, once again this season, I would say. So
yeah, with Trey Lance, there was a report that they might try to trade him and just roll with Purdy, which obviously kind of goes out the window with that injury. But it didn't really make sense to me anyway. If they were going to trade him and the reported price was something like a 3rd round pick, it was like, what? Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just keep Trey Lance? I mean, unless someone was going to back up the Brinks truck of draft capital and give you a first round pick for him and you were 100% sold on Brock Purdy, which I don't know how you could be. It's a great run, but we've seen other guys have great runs that were not truly great quarterbacks. So none of that really made sense to me. It makes much more sense to just roll with it. I just like there's scenarios that run through your head, though. The Brady coming back right before training camp. Hey, everybody, I'm back. Right. Derek Carr ends up there somehow, or like you just kind of have no idea. But I think the most logical one is that either one of those guys is starting from day one. How about this one? Sean Payton and his time as a Denver Bronco, more than 1.5 playoff wins in his entire tenure as a Denver Bronco head coach.
Oofta. I should have looked at, I would say, some more specifics related to his contract. I'm sure those details aren't out there yet, but this one's tough. I mean, this one, I think if you were kind of like just looking at, from a marriage perspective or whatever, like going the Sean Payton route with Russell Wilson and the contract and given where they're at, like it probably made the most sense to see if a guy like Sean Payton can potentially maximize and figure out how to put Russell Wilson in the best, position to succeed. So I do get that. I still just don't know if I'm, optimistic enough for that to really happen. So I would say, and given, the AFC West and everything else and kind of where I, believe that, Patrick Mahomes very much is going to be, and also kind of where, Justin Herbert is, even if, the Raiders take a couple steps back, even from where they were, I think it's still a really difficult path for the Broncos. So I'm probably going under 1.5. I guess I'm just not a believer in, the Peyton Wilson, situation really resolving so well that they can, I would say arrive as actual contenders in the AFC.
I just have a tough time seeing Russell Wilson being a different version than what he was last year. Like, where does that come from? Because the athleticism is basically gone, unless he was playing with an injury that we didn't know about that is 100% healed. But usually when you're in your mid-30s, and I know this quite well, if you get the smallest injury, it kind of lingers. That's what makes Tom Brady so ridiculous. Just playing rec league basketball, it takes me like 3 days to recover. So I totally relate to Russell Wilson, a star pro athlete. But I mean, Donovan McNabb was a good example of this to tie it into Minnesota. When he was the same age as Russell Wilson, he was playing as a Viking and he was a hysterical disaster. After being one of the great athletes at his position, a running quarterback, a playmaker. So if that element is not there, then you're talking about a pocket quarterback, Russell Wilson, which is just not Russell Wilson. It's not who he is. What made him great was his ability to make plays out of structure and to scramble. So I have a tough time thinking that Sean Payton just dials up the old Drew Brees package and he can operate it the same way, because Brees was always a pocket quarterback and he was never a big armed guy going downfield. He was just a version of himself that was throwing the ball a little slower as he went along. And not only that, but Brees also, I mean, to me, he's a much better quarterback than Wilson, but he also knew that offense for years and years and years and years. Now Wilson's got to learn another offense that's built for him. I have a tough time with that one. I also think that Sean Payton probably just came for the money. I mean, because there's no objective look at that Denver team to be like, oh yeah, this is on the way there. It's probably just like, 20 million. Yeah. Okay. I'll get some skis.
Right. It's interesting. I do think, how they land at the defensive coordinator position, whether they go with Fangio or whether, they keep a guy, who they have now in Ejiro Evero. But I think it's the point that I was thinking about, and kind of you basically touched on it, was like the ways in which Russell Wilson was actually successful previously, like in Seattle and stuff, was very much on these like almost YOLO deep ball type shots or whatever, that he could sling 40 yards up in the air and 40 yards down and kind of drop it in the bucket. And like, that's never been Sean Payton's offense, right? I know, Drew Brees was very much limited in that regard, but it's very low ADOT. It's being accurate. And I think those are the two spots that Wilson was really, really poor. I would say, especially this season, like not being able to complete those throws or even, come anywhere close. So like there's too many question marks, I would say, to really buy into them figuring it out, especially given the deepness of the AFC. But I think you touched on it. Like the fit just seems odd, even though looking at it from like top down view, it probably makes a lot of sense. But when you dig into some of the scheme based things, there's a lot to, I would say, kind of dislike about both sides of it, I would say.
And I just don't see them coming across receivers who are good enough to be the DK Metcalf or Tyler Lockett that he had. Like those guys are just hard to replace. And I think both of those guys fall into the category of like just below Devontae Adams, Justin Jefferson, but in that second tier elite receivers. And he had two of them. And that does make a big difference. So I'm not buying this, even though I do think Sean Payton is a good coach. On a Minnesota sports podcast, you can only go that far because there's a lot of dislike there for Sean Payton, and I understand it. How about this one? Speaking of dislike for Minnesota sports fans, the Lions, Bears, and Packers. Would you bet any of those teams to make a Super Bowl by 2026?
2000, man, you're putting a lot of pressure on Restore the Roar right here. I don't know. I honestly and going back to the Vikings discussion and stuff, but like if you look around, like maybe outside of Green Bay if they don't get rid of Aaron Rodgers, but it's very hard to not say that Detroit and Chicago are both going to be probably way better than what they were even at this year. So I would be, although I think it's probably a pretty tall task, I also think that the NFC is down enough to the point where one or two, one of these teams could potentially make a surprise run and do it. I think if you gave me a little bit further of an extended out window, I would buy into, the Bears specifically, just because I do think that, Justin Fields can kind of turn it around. And if they do decide to, stockpile, other opportunities at other positions, and he does kind of hit in that third or fourth year, like their window is probably, I would say, open for a number of years. I do still think, for as much love as, some people like to give Jared Goff, I think there is probably a question of how good he's going to be long-term, especially if they don't have Ben Johnson in the fold. I know he's signed on for next year, but I think when he kind of steps away, like there could be a pretty big shift for the Lions offensively. So although I would say I'm maybe probably, decently bullish on both the Lions and the Bears, I think the answer is still probably no. To get there in 2026, I think the Bears are probably going to need a couple more years and still very much probably have too many question marks for me to really feel confident about, them arriving probably ahead of schedule at that point.
Yeah, and I'm trying to figure out also still, along with the rest of the world and the Chicago Bears, what Justin Fields really is. Because last year he had a Vince Young season where his passing was still pretty bad and his running was spectacular. And they were able to stay competitive in games because his running was great. But that always has a ceiling on it if you can't at least throw competently. But also offensive line, receivers, like all those things. They were horrendous, about as bad as you can set up somebody who's only in his second year. And just looking back historically, I looked at all the rookies' second years back to like 2000 or something, and it was really kind of inconclusive through 2 years. Through 3 years, total different story. You knew who everybody was going to be through 3 years as quarterbacks. So next year should tell us a lot more. I think they could at best have a Jaguars-like season next year where we go like, oh, that's a team on the rise, but we're probably not saying they're there yet. But with the cap space they have, man, I mean, they can spend and spend around Justin Fields almost as much as they want for probably a couple of years. But they'll have to hit on some draft picks. I'm not entirely sold on that. Isn't Jared Goff one of the weirdest quarterbacks ever? I mean because nobody ever thinks he's a number one pick. No one ever thinks of him as being great. And when you watch him, you never think like, whoa. But at the same time, he's led 3 offenses in the top 5 in scoring in his career. And, last year you could look at as an anomaly because they were trying to lose. I guess I've always wanted to give him more credit than say like the PFF graders who have never really liked what they've seen from Jared Goff. There is something about the guy being able to operate what he's asked to do, even if sometimes it's not pretty, in particular with like his accuracy could be a bit off or some of the plays are just awful, but it's very Garoppolo-ish where it's like the production though is very good from Jared Goff.
Yeah, the production holds true, like the EPA perspective. Obviously, there's like an element of the, the play calling, and everyone thinks, the Sean McVays or the gods of the play calling and all this stuff. But the high yards after the catch stuff, I think probably gets overstated. Obviously, playing with guys like Cooper Kupp or whatever can help that. But he's had pieces for sure at the wide receiver position. But I'm kind of in agreement with you in the fact that like he probably hasn't gotten enough credit still. Removed from the play calling and removed from the yards after the catch to the point where he is operating really well from an EPA perspective. So I agree with you. I think, where they end up and if they can potentially put a team around him and pay him, still and hit on some of the draft picks, I think is still a question mark. So I would maybe lean more probably more in the PFF grading perspective and outlook of, Jared Goff than you would. But I do think that at least some consideration for, just how well he's done outside of the, the obvious factors that people always point to for why he's been so successful is definitely a valid, valid critique or argument for sure.
I think what it comes down to with him is just when he has an offensive line in front of him, he's legit great. Good, if he could sit back there and throw, he can be accurate. He can be extremely sharp. He can operate whatever. But if anybody moves him off his spot, it's like Drew Bledsoe-esque to me. Right, if anybody moves him off his spot, like just forget about it. That's not happening. But if he can stand right there and step and throw, he's as good as anybody in the NFL. And I think the way they've built their offensive line gives them a chance to be a legitimate contender next year, depending on what they do this offseason. But I think the roar has been restored and they're on their way. Chicago is much more variance when it comes to that. And Green Bay, I really have no idea. I think, if they hit on Jordan Love, they're in a weird position to then have to pay him instantly, which then makes everything so much harder. And a lot of their players are getting older who are keys guys for them. But if Christian Watson becomes great, maybe there's a chance. I just see them as being like behind the other teams that recently tanked. On to a couple of the Vikings ones here. Would you bet that this offseason, Justin Jefferson signs a deal worth more than $30 million per year average annual value this offseason?
I think so. I honestly think they're going to do it. I think they kind of have to in a lot of ways as well. And I think the dollar figure in APY is only going to go up. So if they do want to lock in, I would say Jefferson, like this is kind of the offseason to do it. He's definitely shown that he's very much going to be like the best receiver in football over that contract length. So I think just giving it to him, figuring out the rest later, maybe still, trying to resolve I don't want to call it a situation at quarterback, but the multiple year outlook for how they're going to actually have a guy, maybe even if it's a guy on the rookie deal, to potentially pair with him. Like that's all questions I want to answer probably after locking in Justin Jefferson long-term. So I like the play. I hope it happens. I think it needs to happen at this point for Vikings fans as well.
I think they go to him with a blank check, but my question is whether he signs it, because it's a guarantee for him that he will make money and catch passes. But is it a guarantee that he wants to be a Viking and do those things? Is it a guarantee that he wants to stay here through whatever they draft as a quarterback? And then it's a little chicken and egg, right? Like if you're a quarterback in college, if you're Anthony Richardson or Tanner McKee or whoever, and you get picked and you get to throw to Jefferson, you're probably going to be a lot better than you would if you threw to whoever the hell that
Velus
Jones was throwing to this year or something, or Justin Fields. But then if you're Jefferson and you're like, wait, you guys are going to draft a quarterback. I don't know if he's going to be good. I don't know if I want that guy. If I waste 3 years of my career because you guys draft the next Zach Wilson, then what? I could see him saying, I'd rather wait another year and see where this franchise stands than play this out. And I don't know how he feels about Kirk Cousins. I think that he's always been a defender of Kirk Cousins, but at the same time, he's never seen the second round of the playoffs. And I think that he wants that as well. And that's tied to the quarterback, and the money is tied to the quarterback. How could you sign Cousins to a 5-year extension and make him a Viking for the rest of his career if you're also going to pay Jefferson and Darisaw two of the highest paid positions? Like, this just doesn't work out. So if you're him, I think you want to know where you stand before you put the pen to paper.
Yeah, it is really interesting because I think the key for me is not understanding where he's actually at with Kirk Cousins. Because like you said, like publicly, he has very much said probably as much as you could expect and very much been a vocal supporter of him. But if he doesn't buy into Cousins even long term, like he could balk this offseason, right? But I think if he doesn't balk, like it might not be that he's completely committed to Kirk Cousins, but at least he understands that like he could maybe get to where he wants to go with Kirk Cousins at quarterback. So it is an interesting, dichotomy for me. I do think that I probably would have, expected him to sign it and maybe was viewing it more as like the Vikings need to make the decision. But, how he evaluates where this quarterback, where they're going to go at quarterback very much is kind of going to be the litmus test for whether he actually signs it or not this season. But I think that very much, has to play into the Vikings' direction, both this offseason and how they want to approach next year as well, too. Right. So it's a lot of interesting, and that's why it's so weird to be on with the Vikings, because it's like they very much have such a wide range of outcomes for where they could land at next year, and then they're like, it's more of the same or something too, right? So it's definitely an interesting discussion, I would say.
What a perfect lead into my next bet, which is Vikings over under 9.5 wins for next season.
I'm going to take the under. I have to. I mean, I think, given the schedule basically is obviously going to be difficult playing, the first seeds of the other divisions. I do think that the NFC North also got a lot better. And like, there is, I think for Vikings fans that do want to maybe play the long-term game or whatever, like there is a pretty strong case or underline for why you don't want to, you don't want to go 8-9 or whatever. Right. And you in some ways don't want to go like 6-11 either. Basically, like you kind of want to be, 3-14 or something next year and have the high draft pick and be able to choose a guy like Caleb Williams or Drake May and very much, answer that question for Justin Jefferson at quarterback, or kind of swing the other way. And to me, like they're not, especially with how they, landed at the end of this season, like they're just not, even in a weak and, down NFC, like I just don't see outside of like a number of breaks for them actually getting through to the Super Bowl. And I think if that's your goal, if that's like your goal is just to make it to another first round or second round playoff exit, like it's probably time to go the direction of the most pain in the shortest outlook, and then kind of arrive at where you want to get to after those dark days, I would say.
I mean, if you think about it, this year their point differential suggested they were more like an 8 or 9 win team. Right. And that doesn't mean you didn't win the games and that we all didn't have a lot of fun covering them. But if they were to play this version of the team next year against the schedule they're going to face, which is a lot harder than this year's schedule, you're talking about probably a 6 or 7 win football team if they run a lot of the same things back, and then people are older. So they have to make some major overhaul types of changes, and they have to be ready for a setback. But you could also see them trying another Zadarius Smith-like move or a Patrick Peterson-like move. Like, hey, it worked for us last year, so let's just get a veteran this or a veteran that, or, hey, we'll draft this, and I'm sure that guy will step in right away, even though a lot of times the rookies do not step in and make a huge impact right away. You could see them taking that approach and getting to like 8 or 9 wins, or even 10, depending on how things play out. Right. Because if Fields is horrendous and you get 2 wins there, or Jordan Love stinks and you get a couple wins there, like I could see 10 wins. And when I get a final look at it before I pick the schedule, I probably will pick 10 wins, just knowing the way that this team has always sort of operated with, well, we're going to cobble together these free agents, and I promise our draft picks will be better, and this player will be better next year, and Kirk sort of sets a floor for you. So I think that if you're picking it, you'd be only picking to probably get to 10 at this very moment where everything can still change. But the under makes a lot more sense.
Right. Yeah. There's no doubt about it. I mean, like all the cases, I think like you said, like in the most bullish cases, it's like, it is squeaking out 10 wins, right? And it is very much there because like they don't have a ton of options outside of like in some ways tearing it down defensively as well, right? And then running it back, hoping guys like Louis Sign are like backing in the fold, and hoping some of these younger, cornerbacks can very much figure it out in a new defensive scheme. But like they have maybe a little bit of flexibility, but there's just not a lot out there at key positions that they really want to go after from, the veteran market. And, even Zadarius Smith, like really high, pressure rate, everything else, but just like, kind of wasn't there from a sacks perspective in the latter half of the season. Right. So it's like they hit and they help, but there has to be, I would say, especially from the front office, the understanding and viewpoint that the record was what it was last year, but it probably isn't the perfect reflection of where this team is currently at and what we can expect, from that team again in 2023, I would say.
And I think the reason that you hire Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah is to realize that, and not Dave Gettleman, who might not.
Right.
Okay. Two more real quick. Vikings draft a quarterback What odds would you put on it?
Any round quarterback? Is that the
Well, how about we go first round or second round,
first
but they
round?
don't have a
Okay,
second round
okay,
pick. So first round
right,
quarterback.
okay.
Any round they probably will.
Yeah, I would say pretty low. I mean, at that range where they're at, like it feels like it's only kind of like an Anthony Richardson sort of choice, I would say, because it is a little bit of like a dead zone from the court. Like the latter half of the first round, kind of, unless there's like nobody really at the top, it always seems to kind of be this dead zone towards the end. So I would say probably under 15% chance they draft a quarterback, under 10% chance they draft a quarterback is my read. But I do think they're going to go late round. I think like the Nick Mullins trade and everything else kind of signaled like he is like the short-term, backup, but they very much need to and should draft somebody to at least, I would say, kind of fill in that backup gap for sure.
I just hope that I don't hear anyone say we're looking for the next Brock Purdy.
Right.
Because
you'll hear it.
just like in Jalen Hurts' year, it was everyone was talking about, we could use a Taysom Hill type. This guy's a real Taysom Hill type. And I haven't heard that since because Taysom Hill doesn't matter that much. But I think that you're probably in the right ballpark. I also think that you hired Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah to do the smartest things for your franchise. And the smartest thing might be to trade up to 15 or whatever and get the fourth or fifth quarterback off the board, because in recent years, that has not meant that you get the worst quarterback. And sometimes It's even meant you get the best quarterback. That was definitely the case with someone like Lamar Jackson. I think that makes so much sense, and they're in a rare position where you actually could let the guy sit for a year and then move on from Kirk Cousins. But it also just feels very pipe dreamy compared to what they've done, because for years there's been a case to do this, and every year it was the same, like, well, we need a corner, we need a guard. Like, is this at some point you realize that there's nothing more important than this?
Right. I mean, that's it. And honestly, like, you mentioned it though, right? Like Lamar Jackson, like he was there at the end of the first round, probably the only one that like kind of hit there and like kind of made sense. And like the Vikings very much didn't have the solution at the quarterback position or whatever, right? And it's like the more you at least take those swings of the bat, like the better opportunity you have to at least find that guy, right? And if you're not willing to even swing the bat, like that's on you. And I do think it goes back to Kwesi, and I do think it goes back to like, he obviously understands the opportunity to draft a quarterback, especially maybe in that range. And so that should and probably does provide some signal that the odds should be a little bit higher than what I projected. But it's still a spot where it seems like unless they do give up some draft capital and get up to, I would say even before 15 or something, unless they identify something in a guy that, they very much believe in, like, I just don't see them making that risk given the current state, I would say. So,
okay, last one for you. Would you bet that Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah and Kevin O'Connell get second contracts as the Vikings head coach and general manager?
I will bet, yeah, I do think so. This is obviously like a pretty big inflection point already, I would say, in some ways for that. But I do think there's a path to them even having a down year and kind of resetting and maybe not having to go through the complete rebuild and then being, on the verge of the playoffs once again in 2024, very much like in contention with teams like Green Bay and teams like Detroit and teams like Chicago. So I think we see it. I was really bullish on, the how it kind of landed last year for both of them. I did think like, the marriage between them two or whatever, like seemed to make a lot of sense. And I think, after year one, they exceeded expectations in seemingly every single way. So I think you have to buy into that. And I think that, they definitely identified Kwesi as the guy who can figure out the long-term solution at quarterback. So giving them the opportunities to actually do that, I think is in the best case of, Vikings and Vikings fans. So I would love to see it. And I do probably bet it to happen, at greater than even odds, I would say right now.
I think so too. And I think that as long as the culture is generally good, the ownership is patient, and they really seem to only want to step in with Zimmer and Spielman after things got very toxic. in the front office rather than even just the winning part of it. That was what seemed to put them over the edge. And with these guys, I think they've gotten that down a little bit better. However, losing destroys everyone's soul. So if that's what it really comes down to me, is that I think this offseason will determine that. Because if they don't nail this offseason, and I'm not even saying the direction that I think is right will determine that, they might run it back and be great again. But if they fall apart this offseason and don't have a good draft and don't pick up good free agents that work for them long-term, or don't manage the cap well, or don't manage the quarterback situation, or don't manage Justin Jefferson, there's so many things resting on this offseason alone that you are going to go one way or the other. And if they go into the mediocrity route, because they don't handle it well, then they might not get second contracts. I think there's a reason why they went short term with both guys, because it was kind of like, we're going to throw you into the fire and see what happens, but not lock ourselves in for 6, 7, 8 years, like, with some other head coaches or with general managers. A fascinating situation, Ben. Let me close on this. Who's going to win the Super Bowl, you think?
So I know I'm going against our guy, Eric Eager, but I do think Eagles, it's kind of an interesting matchup, I would say, because, very much like we said, the Patrick Mahomes, top quarterback, everything else versus, the team that can very much get there. But I think Jalen Hurts can provide enough. I also think that, the Chiefs receiving situation is maybe more dire from an injury perspective than what we expected. So I just think that, the Eagles can once again kind of play bully ball. I like their matchup, along the interior offense line and at the edges as well from a run perspective. So I think they're going to be able to establish it early. And I think that if they do, outside of some completely brilliant performance from Patrick Mahomes, I think the expectation has to be that they win it. So I like the Eagles. I like them by a field goal or touchdown, but I also think it could maybe get a little bit out of hand here as well. Kind of like the previous 2 playoff games have.
When you said a brilliant performance by Mahomes, I'm going to make that bet. I'm just going to put it. I'm just going to do that. He's getting my Brady rule where I never bet against Brady. Just because he's Brady. And even when it's 28-3, you're like, well, he probably could. At PFF_Ben Brown on Twitter. Master Chief Officer of Operating Innovations or whatever for PFF. No, you do great stuff. You're a good follow on Twitter, and I really appreciate you coming on. What is the actual title again?
Yeah, so PFF_Ben Brown Twitter. Yeah, head of betting innovation. It probably deserves to be made fun of. So I can definitely. I didn't get to name the title. At least I did try to, but it was company man, I guess, for sure. Unfortunately, so.
Great stuff. Well, good to connect with a Minnesota gone Iowa, such as yourself, and we'll do it again soon, man. Great to talk with you.
For sure. Yeah, awesome. I appreciate it. Anytime. This was a pleasure of mine for sure. Thanks, Matt.